we did some interesting work initially on taxation, related to taxation and the digital space, in which we were seeking clarity from the Kenya Revenue Authority on how that affects the creative sector and so on. So we did some work in that area. Then we also did quite a bit of work related to intellectual property rights, in which we worked with the Kenya Copyright Board as well as intellectual property lawyers. And in this series on business, we already had one session on business planning for the culture and creative industries. And now we are doing monitoring, evaluation, and learning. This work is part of ongoing work at Twaweza with support from the International Relief Fund and the Gota Institute, which is closing at this. I think this will be the last session in that marathon of activities. And we're really privileged on the business space to be working with Kathrin Schmidt, who is a cultural and creative industries consultant and researcher. And she's been doing very important work. In fact, when we met, she was doing work on strategy. And so she does work on strategy, she does work on research and evaluation of the culture and creative industries, with wide experience in the UK as well as across Africa. So she took us through the business planning session, and she'll be taking us through the monitoring and evaluation and learning session today. But before I bring her on, I would like to ask Irene, do you want to make a comment about our own Mel?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on monitoring, evaluation, and learning. My name is Irene. I'm from Twaweza Communications, so part of the team that is coordinating and scheduling some of these capacity development forums that we've been having over the past, has it been 5 months or so, on many different topics, and now on something that is so important to projects, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So the questions that I'm coming into the session are, who is supposed to do the monitoring if I'm working on a project? Because, you know, is it that there's this special person separate from, let's say, the project coordinator or the project manager, who then does the monitoring? Because you know, even sometimes you engage with development partners and they say, no, we need, or we will send our person to do the monitoring. So who is it who is supposed to do the monitoring and evaluation? And at what point does the monitoring and evaluation begin? Is it something that is written into a project or a business, because some of our partners maybe are running businesses? Is it something that is worked into the beginning of our project? Or, you know, I know we discussed business plans last week. Is that something that is written into our organizational planning? And then finally, so because we've included learning as an important component, who is the learning for? Yes, the project is ours, but we might have stakeholders or people that we are interacting with at different levels. So is the learning just for the organization, or is the learning also for people at, I mean, the different stakeholders that we are working with? So those are my, I don't know whether those are too many to start with, and they don't need to be answered now. I'm sure we'll get to learn more as we go along. But I just thought as I come into this discussion and opportunity to learn, this is what I would like just to get some information on. So Prof, it wasn't really comments, it was like, you know, what are my thoughts as I'm coming in?
Thank you very much, Irene, team. At this moment, I would like now to ask Kathrin to move with us, because maybe you might just run this, but we have opportunity along the way to ask questions, to intervene as we move forward. So, you know, once you've covered sufficient ground, you can pause so that people can ask questions or make comments So ball in your court now, Kathrin. Really nice to have you today again.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Kimani. And Irene, thank you very much for your questions. Your questions should be answered by today's session, but in case they're not, then we can certainly discuss them in more detail again at the end of the session. So I hope that sounds okay to everybody. Can everybody hear me? Maybe just
yes, I can.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll share my screen now with you, and then it'll be easier for everybody to follow the presentation. Can you see the screen?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Okay, well, welcome again. Today's session is on monitoring, evaluation, and learning for the cultural and creative industries. And monitoring, sorry, I'm just reading a question from Sahid. So, so my presentation, he's asking how long will the session run? So my presentation will be for about 35-40 minutes, but it then again depends on how often we will stop for questions and how much how much discussion there will be within the group. But I think that should also leave us ample time at the end to cover any additional questions or any sort of comments you might have. So I think, Kimani, we are scheduled to finish by 5 at the latest, aren't we?
Yeah, we have ample time. I think we finish when we want to finish. So
okay, great. Yeah. Great. Okay, let me dive in then. So monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or MEL, is obviously an enormous field of research and practice, and it is very closely linked to project management strategies and results-based and adaptive management approaches. And it is a continuously growing field, and recently more acronyms have emerged, sort of focusing on other aspects as well. So for example, some people now talk about MEAL, so monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. Other people talk about MELA, so monitoring, evaluation, learning, and adaptation. So so just to say this, to sort of highlight that obviously this is a big field of research and practice, and it is a profession in itself. So today is thought as an introduction, an introduction to the key concepts and key approaches to MEL. But if it is desired, if it is useful, and if we can make it happen, I think it would be great to have another session or even a number of more sessions about monitoring, evaluation, and learning, because it is so important. And there's definitely scope to dive deeper into some of the aspects that we will discuss today. And it might also be useful to do some, concrete exercises and talk more about examples. So yeah, please just think of today as the first step in a hopeful, interesting journey. And so MEL, as I said, has grown in importance over the last decade or so, and it has actually quite significantly changed the focus from what organizations want to achieve to what they can actually measure. And this trend has also been complemented by an increasing emphasis on numbers over narratives. And of course, this is really, really important, and it is important for an organization to understand and measure the outputs, outcomes, and impacts of its projects and actions and activities. But this does not mean that MEL should take precedence over other parts of your organization's work or your business. So on the contrary, MEL tools and systems should be seen as helping you to rationalize the way your organization thinks about itself and its own agency. So I just wanted to sort of at the beginning stress that very clearly, that MEL is not an end in itself. It is a very, very important and useful thing to do for your organization, no matter the size or the scope of its organization. And So monitoring and evaluation all deal with collecting, analyzing, and using information to enable decisions to be made. And both monitoring and evaluation are also concerned with systematic learning. And so I've structured today's session as follows. We'll talk just briefly about the definition of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Then I'll outline some of the key factors why MEL is so important. We'll discuss some of the sort of key terms that are usually used within the context of MEL, just in case some of you are not familiar with those. And then we'll look in a bit more detail at MEL practice and effectiveness, at different MEL practices and approaches. And then we'll finish the session by looking at the key steps in the MEL process and tools that you can use to collect both data for monitoring and evaluation, but also tools to share knowledge and increase learning. So let's begin by defining monitoring. What is monitoring? So it is a continuous process by which stakeholders obtain regular feedback on progress towards achieving set milestones and results. And so this means that monitoring often focuses more on processes, activities, inputs, and outputs. But this doesn't mean that it is only concerned with projects and the monitoring of processes within a project. It can also mean monitoring of your overall organization's human, financial, and physical resources. Evaluations, on the other hand, aim to influence change through critical reflection on what works and why, and to inform immediate and future actions and to increase the effectiveness of projects and programs. So this means evaluations are the periodic review of the results of a project or program towards its planned outcomes and higher level objectives. And this usually happens at midterm reviews and at the completion of a project or an activity. And so, as you can see from these two definitions, both monitoring and evaluation processes enhance the effectiveness of project implementation, and they contribute to its ongoing revision and update. And monitoring and evaluation also enhance learning, and they encourage innovation to achieve better results and contribute, for example, to the scaling up of projects. And so in terms of learning, more qualitative and participatory approaches become particularly important. And so in the context of M&E, learning is defined as formulating and implementing responses to identified constraints to improve a project. But learning also should really cut across all levels of organizational activity beyond your projects and thereby enhance overall organizational development. Unfortunately, however, learning aims are often given less priority than the monitoring and evaluation purposes of MEL systems. But collecting and analyzing and making sense of data and information is a great learning opportunity for any organization. And for example, at project level, you can learn what works well in a particular context or what does not work well, which aspects of a project have more influenced the achievement of results, which strategies can be replicated, etc. But on the organizational level, you can compare results from different projects to determine, for example, which ones contribute to your organization's mission more. Or you can also aggregate the learning from various projects to guide the strategic development of new projects and funding opportunities in the future. So it is really, really crucial to really share learning between projects and programs within an organization and encourage networks across the organization between your various activities. Do you have any questions before I move on to the next slide? I had, there was some, I don't know if somebody was trying to ask a question or if it was just background noise.
It was just a little noise.
Okay.
Oh, we are fine, we can carry on.
Okay, great. So on the next two slides, I've outlined a few sort of key factors why MEL is so important, and yeah, why I think everybody should feel really passionate about it. So as I said, MEL is obviously very, very useful for your organization, but it is also useful for your partners, for your funders, and the communities you work with. And so MEL is a really, really important continuous management function to track processes and assess if progress is made in achieving expected and desired results. It also helps you spot bottlenecks in implementation and address these. MEL also highlights if there are any unintended effects from a project, and these unintended effects can be both positive and negative. And MEL also helps you make better informed decisions that are in line with your organization's overall strategic aims and objectives. And in that sense, it really supports corrective actions in terms of, you know, what should you continue, what should you replicate, and what should be avoided or stopped. And so based on this, MEL helps improve your practice, helps you achieve better results, and it helps you capture and share learnings, as we just heard earlier. And so because of all of this, it is really, really important that you apply all the insights gained from your monitoring, evaluation, and learning for continued improvement to influence the change that you want to achieve, and to ensure that the insights gained from, you know, a particular project evaluation, for example, also serve for organizational and program development. And finally, and this is, you know, one of the main reasons why most organizations do undertake MEL, it helps you demonstrate your results, your impact, and it also helps you be more accountable to funders and to investors. And so all of this means that the processes of strategic planning, monitoring and evaluation and learning are very, very important steps in adaptive and results-based management approaches, which, you know, are intended to aid decision-making towards very explicit goals. And so in this sense, planning helps to focus on results that matter to you and your organization and your organization's mission. And monitoring and evaluation facilitates learning from past successes and challenges. But in addition to all of this, MEL is also a really, really important tool for advocacy. And I think this is often forgotten because many organizations think of MEL as a tedious exercise that they have to do for a specific funder or a specific investor. But I think, you know, we live in a world that is more and more data-driven, and our practices, no matter in which sector, increasingly need to be evidence-based. And I think particularly in the cultural and creative sector, there is a lack of data, there is a lack of insights into what organizations do, what their impact is. And I feel quite strongly about this, because there are so many organizations who do amazing work and really impact, you know, their communities and the wider society, but this is not recorded in any way, or people don't really know about it. And so I think, you know, all of us sort of really need to work on this and need to capture more about our work, need to capture more data. And as a sector as a whole, you know, we really need to, for our own sake, sort of give ourselves more tools for advocacy, and nothing is stronger for advocacy than, you know, data that is, you know, based on rigorous research and evaluation. So let's go through some of the sort of key terms that are often used within the context of MEL, just in case some of you are not familiar with them, and also because there is often a confusion around these terms. They're sometimes used interchangeably. So let's just go through them one by one. So a theory of change is a comprehensive description and illustration of how and why a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context. And you will see on the next two slides two examples of a theory of change, and I hope it will sort of visualize better what I'm sort of about to explain. But so a theory of change defines long-term goals and then maps backwards. And it usually also includes necessary preconditions and assumptions that are needed to achieve what your project or your organization set out to achieve. So in summary, it's a tool to design and evaluate projects by mapping out the logical sequence of an initiative from goals, inputs, activities to outcomes, and it also shows the bigger picture. Results frameworks and logical frameworks are often confused with theories of change, and as I said, sometimes they're sort of used interchangeably. But in theory or in good practice, a results framework is not as detailed and comprehensive as a theory of change, and it organizes the expected results of a project into a series of if-then relationships. So if I do this, then this will happen. And a logical framework or a log framework is a visual representation of the project that describes its key features and the specific logical linkages between them. So they are, yeah, again, like I said, very similar to each other. People often talk about inputs. So inputs are the human and material resources that you use for a project or an activity. Activities, processes are the tasks that are undertaken to transform your inputs into outputs. And then the outputs are the actual deliverables of a project. So they could be anything from, capital goods, products, or any services that you offer as part of your project or your organization. And then outputs lead to outcomes. And so outcomes are changes in institutional capacities, for example, or in specific behaviors. So outcomes describe the more intermediate effects for project beneficiaries or audiences or customers. And then the term impact describes the long-term influence that your project or your organization will have. And so this is often seen as an influence on sort of the wider society or your wider community. And so the whole M&E system is usually composed and based on a set of results that are measured by key performance indicators through specific M&E tools. And so I just want to give you some examples for key performance indicators just to make it maybe a bit more tangible. So for example, in terms of audience development, key performance indicators could be the demographics that you have reached, in terms of age groups or different cultural groups or gender. Another indicator could be participation, attendance, or ticket sales, or even media coverage. And then maybe a more qualitative indicator could be appreciation of and knowledge about, your specific art form or your specific creative industry. Let me move on to the next slide, just to give you sort of an example of a theory of change, and then hopefully, these terms will become a bit clearer. So this is the theory of change.
Kathrin, is it possible to enlarge the theory of change itself? Because I can hardly see, yeah.
I know, yeah, I'm conscious of that. I was just going to say it's not necessary for you to read like all these little boxes. I just wanted sort of to give you an overview of how a theory of change is constructed in terms of the sort of logical sequence. And then the next one, the second one, we can read a bit more detail about it. But I'm happy to share them also.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. That's okay.
But we can also share them after the session by email if anybody thinks that might be useful. So so this theory of change is the theory of change of a program that I worked on a couple of years ago for the British Council, and it was actually a program on cultural heritage in Kenya. And as I said, it's for sort of our discussion now. You don't need to read like all these little boxes, but I just wanted to show you how this theory of change was set up. So here they describe the context of the program. So what is the status quo, and what is the context? I'll just stop here to read a question that just came through. Okay, yeah, let's share the presentation after the meeting. Sure, yeah, and I can share this specific theory of change as well, and then you can go through it line by line. So as I was saying at the beginning, you talk about the context of your program or your project, and then the specific interventions that you will undertake as part of this project or program. And then you outline beneficiaries, who are your target audiences or your target communities, for example. And then this part of the theory of change describes short-term outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and long-term outcomes, and they then feed into the overall objective that you want to achieve. So the sort of very long-term impact that you are seeking to achieve. So let's look at another example. And I've included this theory of change because I thought it, well, in some ways, the design is very different to the first example, but also I really liked the simplicity of this theory of change, while also being very visual and yeah, very clear. So as you can see here, so this is the theory of change of an organization called the Accountability Lab. And so here they have included the assumptions they make about the channels of influence and their organization's success. So, what is sort of needed externally, what are external factors that are assumed to contribute to this sort of change that they want to address. And then here they've also included preconditions that are needed for them to be successful. And at the top here, those little blue circles, you see the input that is needed for what they want to achieve. And then the input feeds into the outputs. Again, we don't need to sort of read all this line by line, but I just wanted to show you sort of just to understand how a theory of change is developed. So the inputs then feed into outputs, which then translates into intermediate outcomes, long-term outcomes, and then even sort of longer-term impact, which is, the overall mission of this Accountability Lab, which in this case is supporting and creating more inclusive and accountable societies. Before I move on, do you have any questions at this stage about the terminology or the theory of change in particular?
Hello.
Hi, Kizada.
Thank you, Kathrin. I have one request that if you can summarize for us once more about this theory of change.
About the theory.
Yeah, if you can go through it one more time.
Sure. Yeah, of course. So maybe before I do that, let me just also say, so a theory of change, as you can see in this example, goes beyond sort of a simplistic input, output, outcome notion of evaluation. And so a theory of change tries to demonstrate through all possible pathways how and why an intervention is assumed to lead to a desired end result or long-term impact. And because because outputs and outcomes are don't happen sort of along a linear line, a theory of change also seeks to include the sort of the bigger picture and a more complex view on, what is going to happen as part of your project or as part of your organization and its work. And so that's why in a theory of change, usually people also include assumptions about, how influence works, how, assumptions about what is needed in terms of an organization's or a project's success. So here, for example, I don't know if you can read that, one of their assumptions is for this theory of change to be successful and for the organization to be successful in terms of achieving what they want to achieve, which is more inclusive and accountable societies. One of the assumptions is all communities and voices are equal. And for example, our team lives by its values. So those are assumptions that are outside, the specific project, for example. But those are still factors that will influence a project and its success, for example. And the same goes for preconditions. Certain things are needed for a project to work, and those are sometimes out of your control because they are external factors. And we will come back to that in a bit more detail in a couple of slides. But just to again sort of, if I go back to the previous slide, so that's what a theory of change. That's what sort of differentiates a theory of change in comparison to results frameworks and logical frameworks, because these just sort of really map the logical sequence from inputs to outputs to outcomes. But a theory of change just gives you the bigger picture, a more complex picture, and also acknowledges that there are factors that are outside of your control. And that is actually really, really important. Because as we all know, sometimes things happen, external factors happen, and then they affect, the delivery of a project, or they affect how much impact we can have as an organization. So let me just go through it then again, sort of step by step. So we have the assumptions here, we have the preconditions here, and then at the top here, they have outlined the inputs that they need to achieve what they want to achieve. So in this case, inputs are relationships, human capital, financial resources, information. And so before I move on, maybe let me just also highlight that this theory of change is quite high level, because it is the theory of change of a whole organization. So if this was a theory of change of a project, your inputs would be much more specific in terms of, what exactly do you need for this specific project. But then, so the inputs are translated into outputs through your actions, through your activities. And so the outputs, again, are the sort of concrete deliverables of a project or a program or your organization. And then they will, in the intermediate and in the longer term, translate into outcomes, which then feed into the overall impact that you seek to make long term on, society or your community. I hope this helps. Does this help? Maybe we can go through it sort of line by line.
I can make a very quick comment. So, because the way I understand is that when you're doing the theory of change for the organization, you go back to the vision and mission of the organization. So how do you see change happening, on account of the ways in which you have stated your mission, your institutional vision and mission? So how does change happen? And therefore, what are those assumptions you are making? So you're making assumptions related to the politics, the economics, the social situation, the economic situation, and so forth and so on, and you do that. So this is the theory of change of your organization. So someone someone working, for example, with on gender rights, you are trying to bring more equity and so on. So there is a theory around. Then, of course, you have now almost the program theory of change, which is again driven by the objectives which you set out. How do you imagine your project or your program bringing about change and so on. So I think that I just wanted to make that comment so that people can see that it can apply to your organization, and it can also apply to the specific program or project that you are undertaking. So it helps you organize your activities, because we are assuming that we are in this world to bring about change. So how are you imagining that change to happen? So I just wanted to make that comment, Kathrin. I hope I got it right and we didn't misrepresent you.
No, great. That was very useful and very well explained. Thank you, Kimani. And yeah, and maybe just to add, as you see, so here we have, you know, the impact that this accountability lab wants to achieve. And that, as Kimani said, you know, you build the theory of change on your mission, and then you map it backwards. So you map backwards. So you want to achieve X, Y, and Z. And then what do you actually need to achieve this? And then you go, you know, so what are the longer term outcomes, and then you map it backwards to the sort of specifics of inputs that are needed, actions that are needed. And as Kimani said, you know, you can use a theory of change for your organization, or you can use a theory of change, like in this example, for a specific project or a specific program. And then, you know, a theory of change for a program or project will be more specific than for your organization, because for your organization, it's just at a more sort of strategic and higher level. Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to go back to one of the questions that we just had. So Samuel asks, can I draw you back to the importance of M&E? What is its importance in relation to advocacy? I do use advocacy. So I think what I was trying to say is that M&E just gives us data and evidence, you know, on our work, on our impact, on the communities that we reach. And this data and information and all these insights are just very, very, very useful tools for advocacy. You know, advocacy with funders, for example, you know, to show our work is actually really, really important and meaningful and impactful. So that's why, you know, we need your funding, and that's why you should be funding us. But it can also be a useful tool of advocacy in terms of policy, you know, to really show the importance of our sector and the work that organizations in our sector achieve. So, so I think that there is just really a need, you know, for each organization to contribute really to you know, more in-depth knowledge, more data about our sector and what we do. Because like I said at the beginning of this session, unfortunately in the cultural and creative sector, there is a lack of data and a lack of knowledge about you know, what we do and the impact that we have, and you know, other sectors are much better at you know, showing the impact of their work, and hence you know, also maybe those sectors are sort of taken more seriously or considered more important, you know, which is a shame, because obviously as we all believe, I'm sure, the, you know, cultural and creative sectors are sort of the backbone of any society. So I think what I was trying to say is just we need more data, we need more insights to help us argue our case, basically. I hope that that makes sense. But we can come back to this at the end of the session as well. I'm sure Kimani also has more to say about that. Okay, so let's talk then about MEL good practice. And Irene, this comes back to one of the questions you asked at the beginning, so I hope this answers your question. So the design of an MEL system should begin at the same time as overall project planning and preparation. So this also means that M&E systems should be designed in close partnership with all relevant stakeholders, because this also ensures that the project project objectives and targets and how they will be measured are well understood and shared by everybody who's involved in the project. So it is really crucial to do this in parallel, and like I said, to also include all the stakeholders of a project. Good practice of MEL during implementation also requires that results indicators and target values have been well defined and agreed upon from the beginning in the MEL framework. So this means you can't just go along and then I don't know, towards the end of the project add another key performance indicator or another result that you want to achieve. So it's very important to be very clear about this from the beginning. And it is also really, really important to establish a clear distinction at project design stage between outputs, outcomes, and higher level, longer term impact. And this also ensures that any selected indicators are appropriate to their respective level along the results chain in the theory of change. So this means that any results are matched to outputs, to outcomes and impact. And this also really, really helps sort of with institutional responsibilities and timelines, and just to be clear about what each stage of project needs to achieve. And as I said at the beginning, just really, really make sure to get stakeholders engaged in MEL. And this is important because it makes MEL more participatory, but also it means that there is real ownership of MEL, beyond your project team or beyond the project manager, which again, contributes to the quality of the MEL, the quality of the data that you will gather, and the quality of insights and the quality of learning that you will achieve. And good practice also goes hand in hand with MEL effectiveness. So how can you make sure that your MEL is effective and achieves what you set out to achieve? So to make the process as effective as possible, it's really important to be clear about what your MEL tries to achieve. So this means be very explicit about decision points, about the processes that are involved, and about the behaviors that the evaluation aims to influence and what you are trying to find out through the evaluation. And we talked a little bit already about assumptions when we looked at the theory of change. But I just want to highlight this again because it is really, really important to be very clear about, the channels of influence that might be outside of your control, and any other assumptions that might make your project a success or not. And this is particularly crucial as it also effectively protects you from changing circumstances outside of your control, as I said, that you can't change. And this can in some cases be really, really important contractually, with regards to certain funders, for example. So it's also sort of a sort of a safety policy for yourself and for the success of your project or your program. And it is also really important to be very clear about the factors that might help or hinder your MEL processes. So as I guess it's just what I'm trying to say is it is just really, really important to be as clear and open about what you're trying to achieve, and which factors are outside of your control, which can affect the project or which can affect the monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And finally, I just want to sort of stress that it really requires a certain mindset and a skill set to develop and implement a good MEL framework. So don't underestimate the task and effort required to do this. And as I said, if we look through the MEL good practice and factors that make your MEL effective, it just requires sort of thought and time if you want to do this properly and sort of want to also capture really meaningful data that is meaningful for you, but also your communities. Before I move on to talking a little bit in more detail about MEL practices and approaches, do you have any questions for me now?
Let me ask this one as we wait for maybe one or two. Most of the organizations that work in the creative sector tend to be quite small in terms of the number of people who are running the organization. And I think that one of the challenges has always been, how do you do M&E when you are so small as an organization? And I don't know what advice you would give people. I mean, do you need a dedicated researcher in the organization, for example, or could the few people that are there, if there are only 3, be able to do the monitoring, evaluation, and learning? So that's one. The second one relates to the results. So you might be undertaking a lot of work on a particular issue. Do you need to track many results? I mean, do you need many indicators of success, or you can just pick 1 or 2? Is there a limit to the number of indicators that one should be following to see whether they're having an impact? And how do you get to choose the 1 or 2 that you are interested in, so that you are not trying to follow everything in terms of good practice? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kimani, for those 2 questions. So let me maybe start with the second one, and we'll come back to this a little bit later as well. But I think so it is really, really important to align your M&E key performance indicators with your project objectives. So, when you start thinking about your MEL framework, then it is really important to look at the project or the program and just to think about, okay, so what is it that we want to achieve? Which outcomes should the project have? And then based on this, you will come up with a list of performance indicators. In terms of numbers, I always advise to keep them to a sort of a shorter list rather than a longer list, because I mean, it also obviously depends on sort of the the resources that you have to undertake this evaluation. But from my experience, the more indicators you have, the more the bigger this MEL exercise becomes, but it doesn't necessarily always give you more insights. So and it often then makes it just really complicated. So I think I always sort of recommend to really break it down to a few core indicators that, as I said, are linked to a handful of project objectives that you might have. And then I think it just makes the MEL also more not just more effective, but also more meaningful, in the sense that you can really prove X, Y, and Z because you have really focused on, I don't know, maybe 5 performance indicators. And that doesn't mean that each of those indicators can't have sub-indicators or performance indicators that you might want to look at. But yeah, so from my experience, I always recommend just keeping it as sort of concise as possible. Just for practical reasons, but also for analytical and sort of learning purposes. And then, so your first question, maybe actually let me move on to the next slide, because I think this will answer the question. Sorry, because the question, as you said, is always who does M&E and who can do it in a small organization if there's not that expertise in-house. So we sort of distinguish very much between self-evaluation and independent external evaluation. And a self-evaluation would be something that is undertaken internally by the team itself, versus an independent external evaluation, which is undertaken by an external consultant who would come in and do this for you. And obviously there are pros and cons to both of them. You know, a self-evaluation will definitely be cheaper and maybe not as involved as an independent external evaluation, but an external evaluation always guarantees you a very objective view on your project, its successes, its failures, its challenges. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I think it just really, really depends on your project, on your organization, on the stage you're at, you know, what you're trying to find out. And yeah, so what the reasons are why you are undertaking this monitoring and evaluation. And before I move on, let me just see there is another question. Okay, so there's a question about indicators, outputs, and outcomes. So let's, Samuel, can we come back to this at the end of the session? Then we can talk about maybe some more specifics if they're not clear by the end of this presentation. So as I said, your approach to MEL will depend very much on your organization and on what you want to evaluate. And there are two levels of MEL, and we've sort of touched on this already. So there's organizational MEL and there's project and program MEL. And at organizational level, your MEL will focus on, you know, monitoring the performance of your organization as a whole. And, you know, so this could include your organization's mission, your organizational structure, your planning, implementation, and MEL processes, the relevance of your projects to your overall organizational mission, and your organizational capacity. And then project and program MEL focuses on, you know, the very specific aspects of a specific project or program. So this means it monitors very specific targets, it evaluates its results, it evaluates its specific changes and challenges. So, so just, yeah, bear this in mind in terms of the two sort of levels of MEL. And then one sort of approach to MEL I want to talk about in a bit more detail, because I think it is really, really useful and it is becoming more and more important, is participatory MEL. So this is about involving project participants directly in the M&E process. And this is really useful because it adds value in two ways. So it ensures that relevant information and experience is gathered from those who are actually immediately affected by your project. And this then also increases accountability to these participants, you know, who have a very direct interest in the success of your project. And secondly, the process of participation also increases ownership of your project activities. And so it also increases the likelihood of replication and sustainability. So as I've mentioned before, it is just really, really important to incorporate stakeholders at all levels to ensure that they, you know, contribute to the MEL process, but then that they also benefit from the knowledge that is gathered throughout this process. Then there are also other forms of very specific you know, monitoring and evaluation practices, such as economic and social impact studies. They focus very much, you know, on the economic impact that your program might have, or the social impact. And then I want to talk a little bit about the difference between formative evaluations and summative evaluations. So formative evaluations are usually undertaken early in the implementation of a project. And this is done to inform the stakeholders about the trends and results, you know, whether the goals of your project or program are likely to be fulfilled, and to identify any potential barriers or sort of factors that affect the facilitation of the implementation of your project. And so the results of a formative evaluation are then usually incorporated into the program as the program or the project goes along. And so this means formative evaluation is undertaken very much with the aim to adjust and improve a project and program as you go along. And so formative evaluations are therefore usually less formal and more likely to be done internally. On the other hand, summative evaluations investigate and focus on what the overall impact of a project or program has been. And so that's why they're often undertaken externally, just to ensure as much objectivity as possible. And summative evaluations are often also published. But then this doesn't mean that findings and learning that come out of a summative evaluation can't be used for the design of a future project or program. Do you have any questions about MEL practices and different approaches? If not, I'll move on. And yeah, if you can think of any further questions, just type it in the chat box, or we can discuss them at the end of the session. So I have included this diagram because I think it gives a really useful overview of sort of the key steps in monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes, and it hopefully also gives you an idea how sort of to progress along this cycle. So you start by delimiting the project, and I've said this, at the beginning of the session. It's just really important to be very clear about what it is that you want to evaluate. Are you evaluating your whole project? Are you evaluating a specific aspect of the project? Are you evaluating your whole organizational work? So just be very clear about what your MEL exercise is trying to achieve. And then sort of hand in hand with that goes setting out MEL objectives. And as I said before, these should go hand in hand with the objectives of the project or the program that you are evaluating. And then we've seen and discussed this step already. It is really important to include stakeholders from the beginning to make sure that this is as participatory as possible, but also to make sure that you capture really useful and meaningful data. And then as a next step, you develop the questions in the sense of, what is it that you really want to find out? What, which answers are you looking for? Which questions need to be asked to indicate, to sort of respond to the key performance indicators? Which data do you need to prove the impact that you have had? And then as a result of these questions and of the sort of wider MEL framework that outlines the key performance indicators and how you're trying to measure them, you create a strategy. You create a very specific strategy for collecting data, and this includes really details like who is responsible for the data collection, what forms and tools will be used, how will the data flow through the organization, and who will make decisions on using the data. And once this strategy is in place and once you have collected all the data, you obviously move on to analyzing the data. And it is then this analysis and the insights that you gain from this analysis that allows you to develop new understanding, new learning that you can then communicate both internally and externally, and that will also serve as a tool for organizational and program development in the future. Before I move on, let me see, there's another question. Develop questions, are they the indicators? No, so the questions that you need to develop, so the sort of core M&E questions need to respond to your key performance indicators. So it is at this point, where you develop sort of the objectives of your monitoring, evaluation, and learning process, and where you develop the framework, which is sort of you know, like just a very brief overview that describes the indicators that you're going to measure and the level of success that you want to achieve. So it is at this stage that you develop the indicators, and then the questions that you develop, the M&E questions, which inform, again, sort of the strategy in terms of the tools that you need, in terms of the data collection that you need to undertake. So these questions then need to go hand in hand with the indicators that you have developed here. I hope this makes sense. Do you want me to go through the cycle again, or is it clear for now?
Yeah, maybe just to help Samuel a little further. So for example, Samuel, you work in a CBO in Nakuru, and you are trying to reduce the number of people who drink alcohol. So you are trying to minimize the number of people, you are discouraging people from over drinking. So your indicator would be something about the number of people who have stopped drinking. You know, so at the earlier stage, you will have known how many people are actually drinking in your county. At the end of it, you want to check how many have stopped drinking. But the questions that you are going to be asking is like, when did you last drink? You know, so these questions are not the indicators, but they help you to start getting to a point where you will know whether you are succeeding or not. So they are not the indicators. The questions are not the indicators. The indicator is like, how do you know you are making progress? And so on. So I think, and I know that Kathrin will be coming back to that question, but I thought I should just do it because I think you've asked it twice, and maybe we just needed to kind of deal with it at this moment. I hope that's helpful, Kathrin, and I hope that's helpful, Samuel, for you.
Yes, Kimani, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kimani. Yeah, maybe just to recap. Again, so you know, at the very beginning, you need to be very clear about what it is that you want to evaluate and why you are doing it and what you're trying to find out. And it is at this stage that you also develop the key performance indicators. And as Kimani said, the key performance indicators basically measure the level of success of a project or a program. So they tell you different aspects of the project, and depending on, again, what the project is trying to achieve, you will then develop your key performance indicators. So as I said, they're going very much hand in hand. So for example, if your organization, you know, say you are a theater organization and you want to increase and diversify your audiences. So that's maybe one of the core objectives of your project. And then a key performance indicator related to this would be, you know, how many audiences have you reached? Have you reached more audiences than you did with your last project or your last program? And maybe also in terms of diversifying audiences, who are these audiences? So a key performance indicator would then be, you know, you have reached a more diverse group of audiences in terms of gender, maybe in terms of age groups, in terms of geographical areas. So depending on what you're trying to achieve with your project, you then have to set these key performance indicators. And then, depending on these key performance indicators, you develop the questions. So which questions do you need to ask to find out if you have reached more diverse audiences, or if you have reached you know, people in different geographical areas. And so these sort of core research questions then inform the data collection strategy and the tools that you will need to use, and yeah, the details of the monitoring and evaluation that you're undertaking. I hope that sort of example helps. But yeah, let's move on to M&E tools, and hopefully this will become clearer. But as I said at the beginning, you know, I think today is very much an introduction to this vast field of MEL, and if it is useful, and you know, if we can make it happen, I think it would be really good to look at some of these aspects in more detail, and maybe even, you know, to undertake some sort of concrete exercises and examples just to make it maybe more tangible, and also help you in developing your own M&E framework, for example. So as I just said, for each key performance indicator that you have set out at the beginning of the project, specific M&E tools have to be defined. Because again, depending on the objectives of your M&E and depending on the indicators, you will need to use different tools, because different tools will give you different types of data and different analysis. So, so for example, to capture quantitative data, people often use surveys and questionnaires or scorecards. And scorecards can, for example, include audience counts or media mentions. And then to capture more qualitative data, people often undertake semi-structured interviews or focus on discussion groups, or surveys and questionnaires with more open-ended and qualitative questions. But case studies and testimonials or workshops and roundtables with stakeholders can also be useful tools for qualitative research. And some people also use field monitoring visits or even sort of observational research to capture qualitative data. And so this table gives you an overview of sort of the most common tools that people use during monitoring and evaluation. But of course, besides these tools, there are also more creative ways of capturing and gathering data. And I think especially you know, us in the cultural and creative sector, we should not shy away from also finding maybe more creative ways of gathering the data that we want. So for example, I know a festival in the UK that commissions an artist as part of their festival to make a piece of work about their program. So this is obviously a very unique and very creative way of doing that. Or a lot of organizations also use more visual tools or more creative ways of capturing feedback from audiences, for example, you know, through drawing mind maps or you know, offering post-it notes, and this often works really well. You know, if you work with children, for example. So yeah, so as I say, to sort of sum up, this you know, this table gives you an overview of the very common tools that are used for M&E that are obviously very useful and very tried and tested tools. But depending on your organization and the M&E that you are undertaking, and depending on what you are trying to find out, it might also be actually really beautiful to think about additional, maybe more creative ways of capturing feedback and data. Before I move on, let me see, there's another question. Scorecards can be likes, retweets, or comments on Twitter and other social media platforms. Exactly. So on a scorecard, you would just capture any quantitative data that you want to capture. And so, for example, if your goal is to increase your social media reach, then yes, you would capture this data on a scorecard in terms of the likes, the retweets, and the comments on Twitter or any other social media platforms. And then you know, this data would allow you to assess if you have made progress in terms of expanding your social media research. So yeah, thank you very much. That's actually a very good example as well. Great. Let's move on to learning and knowledge sharing tools, because they are obviously also quite specific. But before I talk about sort of some of the examples that I've outlined here, let me just also say that and stress that the risk is often, in terms of learning, that it stays with the people who are involved directly in a project. And so that means then that the learning is not shared within the organization internally or the wider community externally. And then the risk is then also that this knowledge and the learning is lost when these specific people who were involved in the project leave an organization. So it is really, really important to ensure that there is appropriate documentation of processes and reports. This can be, a written report, but it could also just be a documentation with visual means like photos or videos. And it is also really important that, any learning, any knowledge that comes out of a project is also appropriately stored for the future, that you can refer back to it, and to make sure that the learning stays within your organization and is independent of, specific people who are involved in the project. And it's also really, really important to keep in mind that learning is not an end, in itself. It's also a means to an end. It allows you to improve results and effectiveness of a project, and it allows you to really improve your impact on your peers, but also the wider community that you work with and that you're sort of situated in. So let's look at some of these tools in detail. So a very common tool for learning and knowledge sharing is outcome mapping. And so this is just a very simple tool that allows you to track progress and identify changes as you go along throughout the project. And this can be in a sort of more narrative way or in a more visual way. Then activity-based knowledge mapping enables knowledge inputs and outputs to be linked in a very systematic fashion in diagrams, for example. So it's again a very visual tool. And the same goes for mind maps. Mind maps can be used for a lot of purposes, but it is also a very useful tool just to capture learning, as you go along or at the end of a project. And similarly, after action reviews and retrospect also allow you to capture learning while doing and learning after doing. So after action reviews capture learning while doing, and retrospect learning after doing. And this is usually done by bringing together a team, just, often quite sort of informally, to discuss a project and to kind of go through specific questions such as, what did we set out to achieve? Have we achieved it? What went well and why? What could have gone better? So this is quite a useful exercise to do, as a team, and just to have a sort of a very, a sort of constructive discussion about it. And then in terms of, storing all this learning and knowledge, it's really important to have an intranet strategy in place, which means just to be very clear, with yourself, but also any staff members that you might have, where do you store all this information? How is it shared? Who can access it? Who is sort of responsible for it? Who monitors that actually people will commit to storing the learning and the knowledge that they have gained through a particular project. So it's just really important to have a strategy around this, and it doesn't need to be a very elaborate, detailed strategy, but just to be clear about how to capture and store learning and knowledge that was gained through a project. And so this could also be, for example, through shared network drives. You can have a place where you just store all the sort of learning documents, any, mind maps that somebody might have drawn, or any sort of minutes from an after action review. And you just share that on a shared drive that all your staff can access. Then another way of sharing learning and knowledge is also blogs. So this can be, internally, if you have, some bigger organizations have internal newsletters, for example, or it can also be external, on your website. And it's often a nice sort of narrative way of sharing learning more widely. And if it's external, then other organizations might also learn from your experience, which I think is beautiful. And then finally, a last example that I want to give is something that I actually really enjoy and I think is really, really useful, and it's called communities of practice. And so communities of practice are groups of people that are very informally bound together by either a shared expertise or a shared interest or passion for a certain topic or a certain practice. And so some communities of practice meet really regularly, at least before COVID. And they, could meet maybe once a month or even once a week for, a lunch or some sort of, session. Other communities of practice are connected primarily by email. And so a community of practice might or might not have an explicit agenda for each meeting or each session. And even if they do have an agenda, it might not always be followed. But the bottom sort of line, no matter how, the community of practice is structured and managed, it means that people share their experiences and knowledge in a very sort of free-flowing and creative way. And this, doesn't only foster new networks and new communities, but it also just really helps people to share solutions to challenges or problems, and to maybe even together come up with new approaches to specific problems. So I think it's a really beautiful thing to do. And again, I think it really helps people, professionals within a specific industry to learn from each other, and organizations to learn from each other and to support each other, which can only make the sector as a whole stronger. I've nearly reached the end of my presentation, but before I sort of recap what we've discussed, are there any questions at this stage? If not, I'll move on and then we can come back.
Sorry, what would you say is the difference between stakeholders and communities of practice?
So stakeholders are, people who have a particular stake or interest in your project. So stakeholders of a project can be, your funders, they can be your audiences or your customers, or participants of a specific event that you run as part of a project. So stakeholders are very sort of focused around a specific project. But the communities of practice are more, professionals, like-minded people who just share, share experiences, share interests, and share learning. So communities of practice are not necessarily centered around a particular project, but more they are sort of bound together by a shared expertise or a shared interest. It could be a communities of practice of I don't know, all the dance professionals in Kenya, for example. So it's a more sort of informal network that allows you, to learn from each other and to, also serve as a maybe sounding board if there are any sort of questions or issues that you come along in your own work. Does that answer your question, Zahid?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, maybe you can dig a little deeper, Zahid. So in our constitution, for example, we talk of communities of. So in the Kenyan constitution, communities of interest are recognized. And if you look, and so you have communities that have common interests and they converge around those interests. But the stakeholders is much more the emotional connection in stakeholders is less. If one were to talk about the affective connection, and much more, very technical type of relationship. And I also think that in our context, you will find that most people in the communities of practice also tend to be in WhatsApp groups and so on, because they have something that they emotionally connect with. Again, I don't know whether I am misrepresenting you, Kathrin, but I was just trying to push this a little more. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And yeah, like WhatsApp could be, for example, a way of for a community of practice to get together and to share information and learning. Okay, great. So I'd like to just recap a bit about what we discussed so far, and I found this really nice image that sort of shows the MEL cycle. And as we discussed, good practice for monitoring, evaluation, and learning is to plan and design your MEL at the same time as designing your project, even before the project starts, because that means all the indicators are in place that you want to research, all the sort of planning process, the MEL framework, everything is in place as it should be before you start the project. And then ideally, but that's not always possible, again, depending on your MEL process and also sort of the type of data that you're gathering, etc. But ideally, also before a project starts, you would undertake a baseline study, because you can then compare your baseline data to the data that you're capturing throughout the project, and then that really allows you to measure what you have achieved, the impact the project has had, and it is just a very obvious way of demonstrating your impact and what you're trying to achieve. So yeah, so again, best practice is to think about and plan your MEL at the same time as you think about and plan your project. And then once the project starts, you continuously capture data. And then again, as we've just discussed, depending on the questions that you want to find answers to, you will choose specific tools to capture the data that you need. And then this data then allows you to do midterm evaluation, and depending on the length of a project, there might be 1 or 2 interim evaluations and reviews, and then all this data and the analysis of this data then feeds into the final evaluation and a final evaluation report at the end of the project. And then all this analysis and all these insights that you have captured and gained throughout the evaluation allows you to identify new insights, new learning, new knowledge that should be shared both internally and externally if possible and if appropriate. And then all this learning should also influence and inspire any future projects that you will have, and then the cycle starts again. So MEL, as I said at the beginning, is just a continuous process of learning, of improving what you do, of seeking to change the way you operate, the way your projects operate, and seeking to change to change and achieve what you're seeking out to achieve, and that's why I also said so it really, I think it is really, really important that we don't think of it as a tedious exercise that we need to do for a funder to receive our last funding payment, for example, but to really see it as something that is very, very useful for us as an organization, but also for, you know, the sort of partners that we work with or the communities that we work with, and to really just see it as a continuous learning process that can only help us improve, you know, our organizations, our projects, yeah, and even ourselves. And so I kind of want to close by saying any MEL you undertake should be useful for you and for your organization. And it should also really take into account, you know, the stated aims of a project or your organization, what the expected impacts are, and who's expected to benefit. And it, as I said at the beginning, it is also just really, really important to be very clear about what you're trying to achieve with this monitoring, evaluation, and learning process. So I'll stop here, and I think we still have quite some time for any other questions that you might have. But before I sort of give you the floor, I just want to say I really enjoyed today's session, and I hope it was useful for you all. And please do let me know, you know, if you have any questions. And I think, as I said a couple of times, it would be also really useful if we can to do another session where we can sort of work through some of these steps in more detail by looking also at some examples, and you know, all this then might help you also to develop your own MEL framework and to just feel more confident about what you can do, you know, both internally and externally. Because as I said before, you know, it's not always necessary, you know, to hire an external consultant to undertake MEL. It just, it depends on your organization and what you're trying to evaluate and what you're trying to learn from it. So thank you very much, and the floor is now yours for any questions.
Thank you very much, Kathrin, for that. Colleagues, questions, comments. I also really did enjoy. I enjoyed the session very, very much. So
Thank you.
I really want to thank you. Any comments? And remember, this was just introductory. In fact, you will notice that there are very interesting areas that Kathrin could go deeper into. I mean, for instance, why do you need an initial needs assessment? You know, I mean, you need it so that it helps you to design your project, so that you can identify the gap you're trying to fill, you know, and so on. And why do you need your baseline, and so forth and so on. So I know there are many opportunities to go deeper into these things, but I really enjoyed today's session. Zahid, I can see your mic is on. Do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, no, I think it was very useful. At least the basic structure has been set out. Now I suppose it's for us to go through the structure and see what our needs are, and, you know, and see if we have any questions. And I mean, the tools particularly are great to look at, but also that we think through both organizational and then project M&E, and what are the differences in it, and how do you achieve both, and also that to try and make this in a way that you take all the ideas and build a very simple framework that can help small organizations and small projects do an M&E without getting overwhelmed or having to call for external evaluators or help like that. I think a lot of it can be synchronized. So perhaps that is one challenge that we need to deal with, the small organizations within the creative sector in Kenya.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it is just really important that you know, the MEL that you will undertake makes sense for your organization and your project. So as you said, Zahid, it doesn't make sense, you know, if it's a small organization or a small project, that you overload yourself with, you know, like extensive MEL. I think it's much more useful to really be very clear about, you know, what do we need to know to move forward, what do we need to know to improve our projects, or to learn as an organization, and then to focus on this, because obviously you could, in theory, research anything, and it's, very interesting, but it might not be that useful for you in, that particular point of time.
Yeah, agreed. Yes. Kimani, perhaps you might like to think in terms of taking this and translating it into the needs of the local creative sector, and then having a small session, with the creatives, whether you are a painter doing a graffiti, or you are somebody like Gado doing XYZ, the basic structure applies, and see how we can make it easy for the small teams to really take on M&E as a learning and fun tool, rather than something that blows your mind when you just hear what's it all about.
Exactly. And I think also, as Kimani said at the beginning of the session, I think a lot of, organizations and professionals in the cultural and creative industries are scared of MEL because they think it's this massive job, and it's all based on, quantitative analysis and all this. But I think, particularly in our sector, we should not be afraid to focus on the qualitative, for example, which doesn't mean you don't capture quantitative data and kind of basic data like, the numbers of audiences you reach, for example. But I think, there is a lot of meaning and a lot of learning that can come out of qualitative research and qualitative data. And I think, a lot of creative professionals can be actually quite strong in this, because it is really sort of looking at the why, the why of certain projects and certain activities, and really sort of digging deeper and trying to understand, the bigger picture. And so I think maybe that's also an important thing to sort of think about.
Yes, and Zahid, you're right. I think that we are doing this on a very general level, but we do need to look at the various subsectors and how they could actually do their monitoring and evaluation and learning, and so on. And I also think really that for most of our work, we will actually go far if we work around the qualitative. I find testimonials to be really very powerful, and I think there's also work to be done everywhere for people to see that it's just not just the numbers. Sometimes when I watch a theater piece, I feel a huge impact on me. It comes back to me over and over again, and it could actually even shape my thinking. So how do I do an evaluation of a theater piece beyond, of course, the number of people who came to watch it? It's is it in the form of, for example, the use of certain words from the audiences? Did they say, I feel extremely happy, I feel sad? We start seeing the emotion that comes out of that experience, and so on. So I think we need to keep building this capacity, and I also think that to know that we can package our monitoring and evaluation in videos, in different in graphical forms and so on, other than just in tables and pie charts and so on. And I think this is very good. And Kathrin, I really want to thank you for this. We'll definitely look for additional opportunities to go deeper into this, so that we can continually improve ourselves, and that even the reporting, the documentation of the experience from the cultural and creative industries can be more creative than ordinarily, the way we present, monitoring and evaluation reports. Is it possible for us to have more creative ways of presenting the results of our work, other than in doing it in the traditional traditional reports, which can be very distancing. Yeah, and so that's good. I don't know whether there's any additional comment from people.
Yeah, and I think just to add to what Kimani you said, when small organizations are given grants like the Go Down or any other organization, I mean, embedded in that grant should be either or, that you either have an M&E consultant, or the organization appoints somebody as part of the grant to be with you throughout the project and do this M&E. And start creating, because when you do that, you'll start creating capacity for learning within the artist group or the theater group or whatever. That may be something we should really consider and help out artists, that you embed somebody within the project to do M&E. And I think that will achieve both in terms of reporting to the funder, but also the group itself in terms of learning internally.
Yeah, because somehow the MELA or MEL tends to be an afterthought, other than something that is embedded right from the beginning. So I think
absolutely,
yeah.
Exactly. And I think also, the fact that arts and culture are more and more promoted in terms of contributing to people's health, or contributing to social cohesion, or peace building, or you name it. I think it's just really, really important for us as a sector to really understand better, what do we do, and which impact does our work have, and again, I keep coming back to this, but I think it's just a really, really important basis for for advocacy, and for really sort of showing people how important our sector is, and so yeah, the more we can understand and the more insights we have, the better.
So again, maybe Zahid, you are not aware, but one of the things we've been trying to do to push availability of data for the creative sector is to really build knowledge within the National Bureau of Statistics, so that they can see the diversity of the sector. Because when they are collecting their data, they always think that it is just entertainment. So they collect their data from nightclubs and places of entertainment, other than really understanding the breadth of our sector. So we've been trying to talk with them. We've been urging them to revise, and they're starting to revise their parameters. And we've gotten to a point where we have told them that the sector requires a culture and creative industries desk, so that whenever they are collecting national data, we are able to give them the right questions to ask. So we are still trying to do this, because we do require the data so that we can do better advocacy. For instance, I mean, we need to find out how many of our urban centers have entertainment centers, entertainment places. What is the diversity of those entertainment places? How many have places where, if you wanted to watch a movie, you could actually go, theaters and plays and so on. And also even just knowing the budgets, how much money is being given to the culture, the culture department in the various counties. What is the percentage vis-a-vis other sectors and so on. So there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done, and I think this work that we are doing is critical. So let's close the meeting. It's already 5 o'clock. I just want to thank everybody. Thanks, Kathrin. Thanks, colleagues, for today. We'll continue learning. We'll continue reaching out to all of you as we strengthen the sector.
Thank you, Kathrin. Thank you. Thank you, Kimani, for setting this up.
Thank you all very much for your interest and your inputs. Thank you.